Hi, I am Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
A November fog had rolled up from the river and laid its clammy fingers upon every rail and cornice when the affair of the whispering staircase was first brought to our notice. I had been at Baker Street that evening, prepared for the usual chessboard skirmish with my friend, when the bell below was rung with such violence that even Mrs. Hudson's patient tread took on alarm. A moment later there burst into the room a man in a damp Inverness cape, his hat clutched as though in a gale, and his face the pale colour of tallow. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank God you are at home," he cried, his voice broken between urgency and exhaustion. The stranger smelled of wet wool and coal smoke, and his hair, though fashionably clipped, had the chaotic lift one sees after a man has run bareheaded through a drizzle. Holmes had not yet risen from his chair, but his eyes, which were listless only when his mind was not engaged, brightened at the first syllable. He waved the fellow to the hearthrug with a hand that seemed languid, though I well knew how swiftly that hand could spring from violin to revolver when the need arose. "You have come from the Embankment by way of Arundel Street," said Holmes, "where you were delayed by a hansom upset near the printing works, and your driver swore extravagantly in an Aberdonian accent. Pray sit. Mrs. Hudson will bring you a hot glass." Our visitor stared. Yes, every particular is correct, but how—" "Your cape," Holmes murmured, "is speckled with pale grit, such as the road menders lay in Arundel Street, the left cuff showing a darker smear of printer's ink. The mud spatters upon your boots, a forward not backward, which tells me you ran. As for the driver, your coin is still clenched, and bears the imprint of J. Mac something, but we are wasting the heat of the fire. Your name?" The man drew a breath, steadied himself, and spoke. "Percival Lennox, sir. I am steward to Lord Bellwater of Ravenscroft House, Grosvenor Place. There has been a death. No, not a death only, but a blasphemy upon nature and sound. We are undone unless you come." "Sound?" Holmes repeated. He steepled his fingers. "Proceed, Mr. Lennox." "It began 3 nights ago, Mr. Holmes, a whispering, human, yet not, rising from the main stair after midnight. We thought at first it must be a draught under the carpet runner, and I sent Peters, the under-butler, to nail the corner. He returned, stating it was no wind. Last night the whispering was clearer, and spoke a name, Rowena, as plain as I speak it now." Here Lennox's voice dropped. "This evening it spoke again, and not a quarter-hour later Mr. Julian Fairchild, Lord Bellwater's ward, was found at the foot of those very steps, his neck broken, his face turned toward the stair as though he had fallen backward in terror. Holmes's face, which is capable of infinite varieties of attention, took on that dry, hawk-like stillness, which in my experience bodes ill for the comfort of criminals. "The police?" "Inspector Lestrade is below even now," said Lennox, "and has placed a constable in the hall. He declares it a misstep, but forgive me, sir. Julian Fairchild was lithe as a fencing master and sober as a bishop. He had gone down not 6 steps when—" The steward's hands trembled. Holmes's gaze flicked to our mantel clock. "The hour?" 9:30 struck scarcely 5 minutes before the 4. "And the house?" "Lord Bellwater entertains this week a small party for the opening of the Park Lane Opera. Her ladyship is ailing and kept her rooms, but there dined with his lordship Sir Alister Quinton, the antiquary, Miss Rowena Vale, a singer, Mr. Tobias Cray, a mining investor from the north, and Madame St. Clair, a mesmerist engaged for after-dinner amusement, though God forgive me for having admitted such a person." "The whisper spoke the name Rowena, you say?" Holmes's tone remained level. Only the slightest angle of his head betrayed interest. "It did, sir." Holmes rose so briskly that the coal tongues fell inward with a sigh. Watson, your hat. Mr. Lennox, you shall return with us. Mrs. Hudson, if Lestrade calls here later, and he may, pray tell him we preferred to hear the whisper's own account. Within 20 minutes, we were bowling through streets where the fog made halos of the gas lamps and horses loomed like spectral dragoons. Lennox, crammed opposite us, stared through the glass as though the very night were league with this unholy voice. Holmes, for his part, had stretched along the cushion, and with closed eyes seemed asleep. I had been too long his companion to mistake the posture for indifference. Ravenscroft House presented, even from the street, a face of mournful dignity. The great fanlight glowed, the steps were wet, and, upon the terrace, a blue-coated constable shifted from foot to foot like a man who will not admit that he is cold. Within, the hush, peculiar to noble houses under catastrophe, had fallen. Servants stood in grouped whispers that ceased upon our entrance. At the far end of the hall, Lestrade, compact and peppery, was scribbling in his notebook. "Ah, Mr. Holmes," said he, with that mixture of relief and bravado he reserves for my friend, "you have a way of being fetched to a corpse as a vicar to a christening." "And of leaving you with fewer pen strokes to make," Holmes rejoined good-humouredly. "What have we?" Lestrade shut his book. "A young gentleman took a spill, that's what. The runner's loose 2 steps down, no doubt he trod the corner, and bang! I've known worse at Hampstead." Holmes's eyes travelled upward along the sweeping oak, the carved newel, the brass rods pinning the red runner, the portrait of a Bellwater ancestor whose stern gaze commanded the landing. "And the voice?" he said. Lestrade snorted lightly. "Old houses creak. If they happen to creak near a soprano, the creak takes a pitch." "Still," said Holmes, "let us inquire what tune it plays." The body had been covered with a sheet and was borne presently to a side room at Lestrade's request, but Holmes stood for a long moment at the base of the stair, his head bent, his long fingers lightly hovering over the lowest tread without touching it. The corridor smelt faintly, and not unpleasantly, of beeswax, damp wool, and something else, a mineral tang I could not place at once. He went up 3 steps, paused, went 2 more, and then knelt. When Holmes kneels at a crime scene, the worldly are apt to kneel in spirit. He examined the left-hand brass stair rod, sniffed the velvet along the runner's edge, and peered beneath the overhang of the riser with a small lens fetched from his pocket. Then he rose and placed his palm upon the panelled wall beside the stairs, moving it gently along until it met a decorative grille, a little lattice of ebony let into the wainscoting. "Curious," he murmured. "Watson, your nose. Do you detect a breath?" I did as he asked. At first there was nothing. Then, as if the house had sighed, a very slight current of cool air touched my cheek, and with it a susurrus, not a word, not a note, but the suggestion of them like a crowd behind a curtain. Lennox drew back. "That is the place. When it speaks, it is here." Holmes placed his ear to the grille and held up a finger. The hall had fallen so quiet one could hear a coal settle upon the grate. For half a minute nothing stirred. Then, thin as a silk thread drawn over glass, a whisper formed itself and slid along the wood. Na." It was not an echo. I heard my own breath and Lestrade's impatient foot, yet the voice was neither of us. It had the queer lifelessness of a note produced by a machine, and yet it shivered the back like cold steel. Lestrade shifted. "A child could hide there with a reed," he said, more sharply than ignorance required. "Or a parlour trick of the mesmerist. The name belongs to the lady guest. Coincidence, Mr. Holmes. I've met worse." Holmes's gaze had travelled not to the grille now, but to the landing portrait above, the old Bellwater, whose painted hand rested upon the carved head of a hound. "No child, Lestrade," he said, "and no reed. A machine may be nearer your mark, though if machine, a singularly crude one." He turned to Lennox. "You said Mr. Fairchild was found at the foot, his face toward the stair. Where precisely?" Lennox indicated a point upon the tiles where a faint, damp outline remained. Holmes measured with his eye the distance from that spot to the third stair where he had knelt. "Peters," Lennox called softly. The under-butler, a thin, anxious man, stepped forward. "Mr. Peters," said Holmes, "you secured the runner last night?" "I did, sir. The corner had come away. I set 2 tacks." Holmes's lip indented. "2? I see but one head, flush and new." He pointed with the end of his lens to the left-hand edge of the runner upon the second stair, where indeed a bright tack showed, its neighbour absent. "Where is the other?" Peters hesitated. "I cannot say, sir. It must have worked loose." "Worked loose or been removed?" Holmes returned. "Pray fetch me a candle and a coal shovel. No, Lestrade, humour me. I will not set fire to your case." While Peters hurried off, we were joined by Lord Belwater, a tall, aquiline nobleman whose white hair and deep lines carried the history of late nights in the house and early mornings in the field. His mouth was firm, but grief was in his eyes. He greeted Holmes by name, and I judged they had met upon some former errand of state. "You see the indecency to which my house is subjected," he said, with quiet bitterness. "If it is a trick, expose it. If a devil, exorcise him." Holmes bowed. "We shall do our poor best, my lord." The candle and shovel arrived. Holmes placed the candle upon the third stair, and with the shovel's edge very gently lifted the runner's hem along the second. A fine scatter of pale dust slid upon the black iron, sparkling faintly in the flame. Holmes tipped the shovel so that the dust lay in a thin line. "Mica," he said as to himself, "and a hint of arsenical green, not from this house." His nostrils expanded a fraction. "And here, a smear under the banister, sticky as if with resin." Lestrade was upon him at once. "What of it, man? London is full of dirt." "Indeed, but dirt, like men, has habits. Pray, Dr. Watson, observe Mr. Fairchild's gloves." They had been placed upon a side table, neat tan leather, fine stitched, the right glove faintly darkened along the forefinger. I sniffed. There was a scent I knew from medical cabinets, sharp, astringent, yet overlaid by something sweeter, as though a perfumer had trespassed upon a chemist's shop. Holmes did not say what I struggled to fix. He turned instead to the grill again, held the candle beneath it, and watched the flame tremble. "Yes," he breathed. "Yes." He looked then to Lord Belwater. "My lord, may I see your guests, each in turn, for a word? Sir Alister Quinton, Miss Rowena Vale, Mr. Tobias Cray, Madame St. Clair, and any servant who handled the stair today." "You shall," said the peer, "though I warn you, Mr. Holmes. Miss Vale is near beside herself, poor child. The voice," he swallowed. "It spoke her name before the fall." Holmes inclined his head. "The voice speaks a name because someone wishes us to hear that name, my lord. Whether to warn or to accuse remains to be determined. We shall know more when the stair chooses to speak again." "And if it does not?" Lestrade asked, with a sceptic's smile. Holmes's eyes glittered in the candlelight. "Then, Inspector, we must persuade it to. Houses, like men, answer more freely when one asks in their own language." He turned his face to the crimson runner, to the brass which had held and perhaps betrayed, and to the little black lattice that breathed like a sleeping thing. In that moment, with the fog pressing its forehead to the panes, and the household gathered at the thresholds like figures in a play, I confess a chill ran through me. For though my reason stood firm beside Holmes, my flesh, like any common soldier's, heard in that faint sibilance, not machinery nor malice merely, but the old primitive fear, that our steps once taken may be counted by something which does not sleep. Lord Belwater led us into a pale morning room whose lace-curtained windows let in the ghostly gleam of the fog. Holmes seated himself near the hearth, calm but alert, and with a quiet nod requested the guests to enter one by one. Sir Alister Quinton came first, stout and red-cheeked, his air that of a scholar affronted by nonsense. "I was Lord Belwater's guest," he said briskly. "We discussed ancient pigments, verdigris, malachite, those green minerals the Romans prized." Holmes's brows lifted slightly. "Green pigments, you say? Interesting. What time did you leave the table?" 10 minutes past 9. I went to fetch a monograph from the library." Holmes asked if he had heard the whispering. "A servant's tale," he sniffed. "Houses creak. Fools listen." Holmes's tone softened, but his eyes did not. "And the smudge under your left thumb, Sir Alister?" The antiquary reddened and wiped it with his handkerchief. "Wax from an old book." Holmes inclined his head and let him go. Miss Rowena Vale entered next, a slim young woman whose grace could not hide her distress. Her eyes were red from weeping, yet she held herself with fragile dignity. "I was to sing after dinner," she said softly. "Madame Sinclair at the pianoforte. I went upstairs to fetch my folio. Mr. Fairchild followed, carrying my wrap. Then came the whisper, 'My name.' He laughed, took a few steps, and fell. Her voice faltered. He had been kind to me. Lord Belwater had taken me under his protection after my father's death." Holmes studied her intently. "No enemies? A jealous suitor, perhaps?" "None that I know. I sing only at private houses." He moved closer, pretending to adjust a chair, and drew in a faint breath. "You wear a peculiar perfume, not floral, rather sharp." "An apothecary's mixture," she replied. "He said it steadies the breath for singing." Holmes merely nodded. "Thank you, Miss Vale. You have aided us more than you know." Next came Tobias Cray, broad and blunt, with the blunt hands of a man who wrestled more with awe than etiquette. "I'll tell you straight," he said. "There's no ghost here. The stair's loose, and the lad tripped." Holmes's tone was mild. "You deal in mines, Mr. Cray. The dust on your boots sparkles. Mica, perhaps." Cray gave a curt nod. "From Derbyshire. Clings to everything." "And the green smear on your cuff?" "Copper stains," he said sharply. "Would you hang a man for the colour of his sleeve?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Not unless the colour hides something worse." Madame Sinclair arrived last, a woman draped in gauze and moonlight embroidery, her eyes alive with ironic intelligence. She bowed slightly. "You too speak with unseen voices, Monsieur Holmes," she murmured. "Only when they choose to answer," he returned. "You were to perform tonight." "A demonstration of suggestion only," she said. "No trance without consent. Mr. Fairchild was to assist. The air of this house, however, is disturbed. There," she pointed unerringly toward the hall, "a vent and another channel beneath the floor. They carry breath like organ pipes. A whisper borne afar might emerge at that grill." Holmes regarded her keenly. "You have a sensitive ear." She smiled. "It pays to know how air moves through minds and walls." As she turned to leave, her shawl brushed the chair and left a thread caught fast in something sticky. Holmes bent, touched it, and said nothing. When she was gone, silence filled the room, except for the clock's low tick. Holmes leaned back, eyes closed. "Well, Watson?" "I said that motives abounded, but means eluded me. Cray is coarse, Sir Alister conceited, the mesmerist a trickster, and Miss Vale a victim. But how does one make a staircase whisper a name? Holmes opened his eyes. By giving the house a tongue of one's choosing, let us collect our trifles, mica dust, green pigment, resin under the banister, a missing tack, gloves scented with sweetened astringent, and a name whispered to frame the most pitiable person present. Do you see, Watson? There is manufacture in this haunting. Lestrade entered with his notebook tucked under his arm. You mean to say the whole business was contrived? I mean, said Holmes evenly, that someone has been drilling holes in the dark and dusting them with Rome. He stood, gaze fixed on the fog beyond the window. Tonight the stair shall speak again, but next time I intend it shall answer to me. Holmes requested that no one leave the house until the morning, citing the oppressive fog as excuse enough. Lord Belwater, resigned and weary, agreed without protest, and the guests were discreetly shown to their rooms under the watchful eyes of the constables Lestrade had stationed at each corridor junction. When the last of the doors had closed, Holmes and I remained in the great hall, the staircase looming above us in shadow. The whispering grille yawned like a dark wound against the wainscoting. Holmes lit his pipe and drew slow, deliberate whirls of smoke that curled upward to the dim chandelier. "Watson," he said at length, "when a house whispers, it is because a man has given it breath." I frowned. "You suspect a device, then? A tube or vent between floors?" He nodded absently. "Precisely so. Yet one must also ask why that breath should speak a particular name, and at such an hour. Coincidence is the refuge of fools. Nothing here is left to chance." We waited until the last ember in the drawing-room had cooled to red. Holmes paced the length of the hall, listening, pausing, listening again. At intervals he tapped the wall with the handle of his walking stick, marking each dull and hollow note in turn. Near the fourth stair he stopped and motioned for me to bring the candle. "Observe," he murmured, kneeling. Beneath the new runner-edge lay a faint seam in the oak, so fine as to be invisible to the casual glance. "A concealed duct, perhaps," I ventured. "Or an old bell conduit." Holmes gave a brief smile. "Bell conduits do not smell of arsenic and copper dust. This house hides a throat, my dear Watson, and someone has been teaching it to lie." He rose abruptly and crossed to the music room, where Madame St. Clair's pianoforte still stood open, its ivory keys dull under the candlelight. Holmes ran his fingers along the lid, inspecting the film of powder upon it. "See this residue? A faint green shimmer, copper carbonate mixed with mica, the same dust we found beneath the runner. Someone carried it from here to the stair. And look." He pressed the low A. The string gave not a musical tone, but a muted rasp, followed by a thin hiss from behind the wall. "Air, Watson, drawn through a pipe hidden within the wainscoting. When one key is pressed with sufficient force, the air is forced through the pipe, emerging near the stair grille. A clever illusion, sound without speaker." I bent to listen, fascinated. Then the voice that spoke, "Rowena," was no spirit, Holmes finished, but an instrument, a mechanical whisper designed to terrify and timed with care. The pianoforte was its breath, the pipe its tongue. Now we must ask, who among them knew this mechanism, and who profited from its fear? At that moment, footsteps creaked above. Lestrade descended, rubbing his eyes. "Still at it, Holmes. The servants are half mad with fright. That blasted whisper started again an hour ago. Just one word, forgive. If it's a trick, it's a cruel one." Holmes's head snapped up. "Was anyone near the piano when it spoke?" "Only Miss Vale. She said she couldn't sleep. came down for her sheet music. The sound started as soon as she entered the hall. Holmes exchanged a quick look with me. Then we are nearer the end than I thought. Watson, fetch your revolver. Tonight may turn uglier than the fog. The hours crawled toward dawn. We stationed ourselves in the hall, the candle placed upon the third stair where Fairchild had fallen. The house was silent save for the faint groan of timbers and the occasional scuff of a constable's boot. Holmes crouched near the grille, lens in hand, while I waited at the foot of the stairs, nerves tight as bowstrings. Suddenly a faint vibration ran through the wood beneath my feet. Then that dreadful susurrus began again, low at first, swelling to the distinct, hollow syllables. Forgive. Holmes raised a finger. The sound originates below, not above. Basement or service ducts. Come. He snatched the candle and strode toward a narrow door beneath the stair, half hidden by tapestry. We descended into a passage heavy with damp stone and the smell of oil. The whispering grew fainter but more mechanical, a rasping tremor through the air. At the passage's end stood a small furnace room where a tangle of copper tubes snaked from the wall like roots of a monstrous tree. Holmes knelt beside the largest of these and pressed his ear to the joint. "There it is," he whispered. Air forced by a bellows connected to a hollow in the stair wall. Someone below can speak into this tube, and the voice will emerge above, as though conjured. He pointed to a fresh smear of resin on the copper mouthpiece. "Our culprit has been here within the hour." A flicker of movement caught my eye, something retreating into the shadows. Holmes sprang forward, wrenching open a narrow side door. A rush of air and the glint of metal greeted us. The figure before us froze in the candlelight. Tobias Cray, his face slick with sweat, a wrench in one hand and a satchel of tools at his feet. "Stand where you are!" I barked. Cray's expression twisted between defiance and despair. "You don't understand, Doctor," he gasped. "It wasn't murder, it was justice." Holmes's tone cut through like steel. "Justice for whom, Mr. Cray? For a woman betrayed or a fortune denied? You built the Whisper to frighten a man to his death. When fear failed, you ensured it by removing one tack and tilting the runner. The mica dust, the resin, the copper smear, all your handiwork." Cray's shoulders sagged. "He ruined her," he muttered. "Rowena's father trusted Bellwater's ward with her dowry investment. Fairchild bled it dry. She never knew, but I did. She sang tonight for the man who stole her future." His voice faltered. "I meant only to scare him, to make him confess. The stare was meant to whisper his guilt, not kill him. But when he turned, he slipped. It was the devil's own chance." Holmes regarded him coldly. "Chance seldom arranges itself with such precision. You removed the tack to fix the pipe's alignment, did you not? The step was loose before you made it fatal." Cray covered his face. "I didn't mean—" His words broke into a hoarse sob. Lestrade, who had followed us down, stepped forward with cuffs in hand. "You'll tell the rest at the yard," he said grimly. As they led Cray away, Holmes extinguished the candle and looked once more at the copper mouthpiece gleaming faintly in the gloom. "Fear, Watson," he said softly. "It is the easiest instrument in the world to play, and the hardest to silence." We ascended again toward the faint light of dawn creeping through the stained glass, leaving the whispering staircase mute at last. The dawn that crept over Grosvenor Place was thin and colourless, as though the fog had drained the very daylight of courage. The lamps in the hall burned low, the constables muttered of tea and warm hearths, and yet Holmes remained restless, his eyes alive with some new unease. Tobias Cray sat in the breakfast-room under Lestrade's guard, hands clasped like a penitent. He had confessed enough to hang a weaker man, yet something in his words had left my companion dissatisfied. Holmes had spent the better part of an hour pacing before the whispering stair, muttering fragments to himself, alignment, tone, airflow, intention. Finally he stopped and said quietly, "Watson, the whisper spoke after Cray was secured. That cannot be ignored." I stared. "You think there is another hand?" "I think," he replied, "that guilt seldom travels alone. Cray built the mechanism, yes, but he was not the only mind that breathed through it. There was purpose beyond vengeance, a precision that smacks of rehearsal. He is but the engineer of a larger deceit." Before I could question further, Lord Bellwater appeared from the morning room, grey and hollow-eyed, yet dignified as ever. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "the constables have removed the apparatus from below. I would see this nightmare ended." Holmes bowed slightly. "You shall, my lord, though not perhaps in the way you expect. Tell me, was Mr. Fairchild ever in possession of sensitive documents, legal, financial, or otherwise?" The peer hesitated. "Yes. He managed the trusts of several dependents, including Miss Vale's inheritance. There were rumours of speculation, but nothing I could prove." "Why?" Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Because the devil's work here began not with sound, but with silence. The silence of a crime buried too long. Someone knew Fairchild's misdeeds and sought not only revenge, but concealment. The whisper was both a weapon and a veil. Lestrade entered then, notebook in hand. The man's solidly caught Holmes. He admits the device, the tampering, the quarrel. The Crown will have an easy morning." Holmes smiled faintly. "And Scotland Yard will have another tidy conclusion. Tell me, Inspector, if Cray is in your custody, who pressed the pianoforte key an hour ago to make the stair whisper again?" Lestrade frowned. "Superstition. Wind through the tubes." "Perhaps," Holmes said, "but I prefer to test superstition rather than salute it." He requested the guests reassemble in the drawing-room. They came reluctantly, pale and wary under the thin daylight. Sir Alister Quinton stood apart, his arms crossed. Miss Vale kept her eyes lowered. Madame St. Clair regarded Holmes with a languid curiosity that barely disguised unease. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holmes began, "Mr. Cray's contrivance is no longer in operation, yet the whisper persisted after his arrest. I propose a simple experiment to discover which of you the house still obeys." The remark sent a chill through the company. He gestured toward the pianoforte. "Each of you, in turn, will strike the lower keys. If any sound proceeds from the stair, we shall know where the spirit resides." Sir Alister went first, grumbling at the absurdity, and thumped the keys with heavy fingers. Nothing stirred but dust. Madame St. Clair followed, her touch delicate, producing a ripple of notes that melted into silence. When Miss Vale's turn came, she hesitated. "Must I?" she whispered. "That sound—" Holmes nodded gently. "Courage, Miss Vale. Fear is the last veil of deceit." She seated herself, drew one trembling breath, and pressed the same key Holmes had identified the night before. The note quivered, and from the hall beyond came, faint but unmistakable, that same ghostly susurrus. "Ro-na." A murmur ran through the room. Lestrade swore softly. Holmes, however, remained perfectly still, his face unreadable. "Thank you, Miss Vale," he said. "You may rise." Then turning to the astonished assembly, he added, "You see, the spirit answers to its master." Miss Vale sank into the nearest chair, white as marble. "No," she cried. "I swear I knew nothing. Only that he frightened me, that awful whisper in the dark." Holmes stepped toward her, voice calm but pitiless. "You knew more than fear, madam. You knew how to summon it. Cray built the device at your urging. perhaps thinking to expose Fairchild's betrayal, perhaps believing himself your protector. But you saw an opportunity more elegant than mere confession. You wished to destroy both your betrayer and your accomplice. You timed your visit to the hall so the whisper would seem to accuse you, knowing Fairchild would rush to your defense and to his death. Her hands trembled, and for a moment I thought she would faint. "It's not true," she murmured. "He wronged me, yes, but I would never—" Holmes's tone softened, though his eyes did not. "You need not speak further. The scent upon your gloves told me what your conscience has just confirmed. Arsenical green pigment, the very compound dusted along the stair. You carried it from Cray's workshop to the piano. The whisper obeyed you because you primed the pipe with the resin yourself. When you pressed the key, it breathed the word you desired. Cray was clever, but you were cruel." Lord Bellwater gave a cry of disbelief, but Holmes raised a hand. "Do not condemn too swiftly, my lord. She meant at first to terrify, not to kill. Yet when Fairchild fell, she found in his death a grim solution to her shame. Fear is a treacherous counsellor." Lestrade, recovering from his astonishment, approached with his notebook. "You're certain of this, Holmes?" "As certain as of my own heartbeat," he said quietly. "Cray's guilt was in the mechanism, hers in the motive. The law must judge both." Miss Vale bowed her head. A single tear traced her cheek before she whispered, almost to herself, "He took everything and left me nothing but the sound of my own name." Holmes turned away. "Take them both, Lestrade. Let Scotland Yard decide how to apportion their ruin. For my part, I am content that the whispering has ceased." As the constables led the pair from the room, the pale light of morning finally broke through the fog, spilling over the stair like a benediction. Holmes stood motionless, staring at the silent grille. I ventured. "You were right, Holmes. The house had a tongue and a conscience." He smiled faintly. "No, Watson, only a mouth and men to feed it words." Outside, the last of the mist was lifting. Within, the whispering staircase lay still at last, its voice extinguished by truth, which, though rarely kind, speaks with a tone no mechanism can imitate. For the better part of the morning, the silence in Ravenscroft House was not merely that of exhaustion, but of a structure emptied of its terror. Yet even as Lestrade's carriage rattled away with his prisoners, I could sense that Holmes's composure masked a mind still in motion. He remained near the staircase long after the servants had withdrawn, his fingers tracing the carved banister, as if listening to something beneath the polish of the wood. I knew that gesture. He was not satisfied. When at last I ventured to speak, he murmured, "There is always a note that lingers after the melody, Watson. Cray's revenge, Miss Vale's guilt, yes, but something in their harmony rings false. The whispering ceased when they were taken, but not because its music is spent. There is one chord yet unstruck." Before I could press him, Lord Bellwater approached, his voice low, his pride visibly broken. "Mr. Holmes, I cannot thank you enough. Still, I confess to a peculiar dread that this affair has left something behind in these walls. The servants swear they hear the stair sigh when no one walks upon it." Holmes's eyes flashed faintly. "Sound does not linger without cause, my lord. If it sighs, it breathes still, and that means an opening remains." He asked permission to make a final inspection before we left, and Bellwater, eager for closure, consented. Holmes began with the pianoforte, lifting its panels until the exposed hammers and wires gleamed like organs under a surgeon's lamp. "Observe, Watson," he said, "our instrument of illusion. But note, there are two apertures, not one. The larger connects to the copper pipe Cray fashioned. The smaller, older conduit runs parallel, but bends away from the direction of the stair. Cray built his device upon another's foundation. He leaned closer. This is no modern contrivance. Ravenscroft was renovated 50 years ago. Such ducts were once used for primitive speaking tubes between floors. Someone must have rediscovered them. Then perhaps Fairchild himself, I suggested. Could he have tampered with them first? Holmes looked sharply at me. Ah, Watson, the question strikes the very marrow of it. If Fairchild were aware of these tubes, he could have manipulated them for his own ends, perhaps to deceive, perhaps to conceal. We have not been tracing a single deception, but one built upon another, layer upon layer, like the dust of centuries. He replaced the cover and rose. Come, we shall follow this elder vein through the house. We descended once more to the servants' quarters, lanterns in hand. The air grew colder, carrying the scent of stone and iron. Holmes's beam of light played over the walls until it caught a faint ring of brass, half buried behind a shelf of firewood. He pried it loose to reveal a speaking tube, its mouth darkened by years of neglect. The old communication system, I said. Precisely. The upper end lies behind the staircase grille, the lower here. But see, someone has scraped its rim clean recently, and this residue— He held the lantern closer, showing the faintest trace of powder upon the metal lip. Plaster dust and soot, but mingled with arsenic green. Cray's pigment, yes, but also something more granular. Ground glass, perhaps, or— No, Watson, look closer. These are crystal fragments. He touched them delicately to his tongue. Salt. Sea salt. He straightened, his expression tightening. My dear fellow, this device was not only a conduit for sound, it carried vapour. Cray's bellows forced air upward, yes, but the residue tells of moisture and chemical dispersal. I believe Fairchild's death was hastened not by fear alone. I felt my stomach turn. You mean poison? Precisely. Arsenical vapour, minute but potent. The stare was both snare and executioner. The whispering frightened him to retreat, but the true killer was the invisible mist rising from the grille. Cray built the pipe for sound. Someone, Miss Vale or another, altered it for death. But if Cray himself admitted tampering— Holmes cut me off. Cray confessed to what he understood. He did not know the bellows had been altered to draw from a chemical vessel hidden in the furnace room. Observed that the whispering continued after his arrest. The mechanism was triggered from elsewhere. The mind that conceived it all, calculating, patient, was neither Cray's nor the lady's. He returned to the furnace chamber, stooping by the copper pipes with feverish precision. Near the base of the largest conduit his fingers found a false panel. He lifted it, and the lantern revealed a small glass retort, half filled with a pale liquid that shimmered faintly green. There lies our missing accomplice's handiwork, arsenical solution mixed with volatile spirits. Once warmed by the furnace's heat, it would evaporate through the bellows and ascend to the stair, a death in whispers. We stood in silence, the horror of the discovery pressing upon us. Holmes's voice came low. There is method here beyond passion. Miss Vale's revenge was raw emotion. Cray's act, misdirected loyalty. But this, he pointed to the retort, is intellect without conscience. It required knowledge of chemistry, architecture, and patience. There is only one in this house with such means, Sir Alistair Quinton, antiquarian, collector of ancient pigments and poisons alike. Even as he spoke, we heard footsteps descending the corridor behind us. Sir Alistair's portly form emerged from the gloom, his eyes glinting with something that might have been triumph or fear. "You pry too deeply, Mr. Holmes," he said evenly. I had hoped the yard's simplicity would suffice. Holmes's smile was cold. So the scholar's curiosity yields to practical application. You found in Cray a tool and in Miss Vale a mask. When Fairchild's ruin of her father came to your attention, you seized it as opportunity, revenge for your own losses, perhaps? Sir Alister's lips twitched. The man was a parasite. He robbed me of 2 patents, mocked my experiments. He thought me harmless, a relic. I only wished him to feel the fear he gave to others. And in giving it, Holmes said softly, you became what you despised. You designed the whisper to drive him to the stair, then turned Cray's invention into a poison, a gentleman's crime, cold, efficient, and cloaked in intellect. Sir Alister gave a weary sigh. I shall not live to see trial, Mr. Holmes. The air here is thick enough with my own making. He drew a small phial from his coat, swallowed swiftly, and before we could move, he staggered back against the wall. Within moments, the light faded from his eyes. Holmes closed them gently. The final whisper, Watson, was not the stairs, but conscience itself. The true curse of the whispering staircase was never its voice. It was the echo of human pride. Outside, as we stepped into the pallid sunlight, the last trace of fog lifted from Grosvenor Place. Holmes turned his collar up against the chill and said almost absently, sound and silence, truth and deceit, each needs the other to be heard. Come, Watson, there is coffee waiting at Baker Street, and I find myself very much in need of the living world again. We did not speak much on the drive back to Baker Street. The city lay under a pale wash of dawn, the streets still gleaming from the night's rain, and the rattle of the cab seemed an intrusion upon the quiet that followed death. Holmes sat with his arms folded, his eyes fixed on the opposite seat, lost in that peculiar abstraction which always seized him when a case had reached both its conclusion and its disquiet. It was near 7:30 when we reached our familiar door. Mrs. Hudson, accustomed as she was to the irregularities of our profession, received us without surprise and set coffee before us in silence. Holmes drank half a cup absently, then rose and began pacing before the fire. "Watson," he said at last, "I have been turning over the nature of the thing we have just witnessed. We began with a whisper, an illusion. We end with 3 lives destroyed, all linked by that same illusion. Yet what remains most curious to me is how simple the mechanism truly was. A pipe, a furnace, a voice, and the human heart to give it meaning. The whisper itself was powerless. It was men who lent it fear." I nodded, for I had seen that truth reflected in every frightened face at Ravenscroft. Still there was a question that troubled me. "Do you believe, Holmes, that Sir Alister meant to kill Fairchild?" His words seemed to imply remorse, not malice. Holmes paused by the window, his silhouette etched against the dim light. "Intention, my dear Watson, is a curious companion to consequence. He meant to frighten, not to slay, yet in choosing the weapon of fear he invited death as its echo. No man can summon dread and remain master of it. It grows beyond his will, like fire from a spark." He drew aside the curtain and looked down into the bustling street, where milk carts rattled and boys cried the morning papers. "There is something in this city, Watson," he said quietly, "that feeds on fear. We cloak it in reason, in civilization, but every so often it finds its voice. Ravenscroft was merely the latest mouthpiece. I should not be surprised if others whisper still." The tone of melancholy in his words surprised me, for Holmes rarely allowed emotion to tint his conclusions. I let the silence stretch until the warmth of the fire softened the edge of our thoughts. At length I said, "You are weary, Holmes. Sleep a few hours. The yard will see to what remains." He gave a short laugh. "Sleep, yes, and dream of whispering staircases, no doubt. Very well, Watson. Wake me at noon." He retired to his room, and I took the opportunity to write my notes of the case while memory was fresh. The morning passed uneventfully until shortly before 11 there came a knock at the door. Expecting Mrs. Hudson, I opened it myself and found Inspector Lestrade standing upon the threshold, hat in hand, his face more grave than I had ever seen it. "Morning, Doctor. I trust Mr. Holmes is in." "He's resting," I replied. "The Ravenscroft matter left him somewhat spent." Lestrade shook his head. "Then I'm sorry to rouse him, but the matter's not ended. We've had a disturbance at the yard. The evidence from the case, the pipes, the chemical files, even Sir Alister's notes, vanished during the night. The constable on watch swears he saw no one. There's more too. Miss Vale escaped custody an hour ago. The carriage conveying her to Holloway was attacked in the fog near Lambeth. The driver's alive but half senseless. It seems she had help." I stared at him in disbelief. Escaped? But to what end? Her part in the crime was clear enough. Lestrade grimaced. "Clear to us, perhaps, but she's cleverer than she looks. The yard found a message scrawled on the wall of her cell. The voice is not silenced. Means nothing to me, but I thought Mr. Holmes might have an opinion." At that moment, Holmes's door opened. He stood there fully dressed, his hair slightly disordered, but his expression keen once more. "Your instincts serve you, Lestrade," he said. "The voice is not silenced indeed. This escape is no accident. Miss Vale has an accomplice outside Ravenscroft, a financier or patron who benefited from Fairchild's schemes. Sir Alister was the scientist, Cray the builder, Miss Vale the lure. But the fourth mind, the architect behind them all, remains at liberty." Lestrade frowned. "You mean there's another player we never saw?" "Precisely. And if I read Miss Vale correctly, she intends to return to the only place her accomplice will trust, Ravenscroft House. She knows something hidden there remains unrecovered. The stolen evidence confirms it." Without waiting for reply, Holmes seized his coat and hat. "Come, Watson. The curtain has not yet fallen. The ghost of the Whispering Staircase demands one final encore." We reached Ravenscroft by early afternoon, the sun a pale coin above the chimneys. The house was shuttered, its inhabitants dispersed save for Lennox, the steward, who greeted us with relief mixed with dread. "The constables left at dawn, sir," he said. "But an hour ago I heard movement near the furnace rooms again, the same passage where you found the pipes. I dared not go alone." Holmes motioned him to silence. "You did well. Remain here. Watson, follow me quietly." We descended the narrow stair once more, lantern light wavering against the damp walls. The air was heavier now, carrying a faint metallic tang. Holmes crouched near the corner where the false panel had concealed the arsenical retort. It was gone. In its place lay a small parcel, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with silk. He opened it gently, revealing a sheaf of papers and a single brass key. "Fairchild's ledgers," he murmured. "And this key, engraved with the crest of Bellwater itself. The missing trust accounts, no doubt. Miss Vale was not fleeing justice. She was reclaiming proof of her betrayal." Just then a board creaked above us. Holmes straightened, eyes narrowing. "Stay behind me, Watson." He moved toward the stair, the lantern casting tall shadows across the walls. A figure stood halfway down the steps, Miss Rowena Vale, her face pale but resolute. She held no weapon, only the glint of determination in her eyes. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice trembling, "I did not flee to escape punishment. There is one truth yet unspoken, one you have not guessed." Holmes's voice was low but commanding. "Then speak it, Miss Vale. Before the whisper speaks for you." Her lips parted, but before the words could form, a sharp click echoed from the shadows behind her. Then a rush of air, a hiss. The old pipe along the wall vibrated once more, and through the dark came that dreadful whispering sound, louder than before, shaping a single chilling phrase. She must not speak. Holmes seized my arm. "Down, Watson! The trap's alive again!" The lantern flickered violently as a thin mist began to seep from the pipe's mouth. Somewhere in the gloom, a door slammed shut, and the whisper grew into a terrible, choking moan. The hiss grew sharper, thickening into a fog that shimmered with a faint, sickly green tinge. The lantern sputtered out, plunging us into a suffocating darkness. Miss Vale coughed once, clutching at her throat. Holmes, quick as thought, seized her wrist and dragged her toward the lower passage. "Down, Watson! Crawl! Keep low to the floor! The vapour rises!" His voice was clear, commanding even in the chaos. The air burned against my lungs as I dropped and followed. We could hear the dull hum of the pipe resonating above, the infernal whisper now pulsing like a living thing. Holmes reached the furnace valve and, using his scarf as a makeshift glove, wrenched it shut. The hiss dwindled to a whimper, the whisper fading with it. He tore open the side vent to let the air escape, and a rush of cold wind flooded through, carrying the poison upward and out. For several moments we stayed crouched, coughing into our sleeves until the acrid sting began to lessen. When at last Holmes rose, his face was pale, but his eyes gleamed fiercely. "We have walked into an unfinished act," he said grimly. "Someone revived the apparatus while we were away and meant to silence Miss Vale forever." Rowena, trembling, sank against the wall. "He's here," she gasped. "I saw him above the stairs, the man who spoke through the pipes before. He's alive." Holmes knelt beside her, his voice gentler now. "Steady yourself. Tell me exactly what you saw." Her eyes darted wildly. "A shadow in the hall, tall, stooped, wearing Sir Alister's coat. But it cannot be. He's dead. I saw him die." Holmes looked toward me. Not if the poison he swallowed was of his own design. He might well have taken a counter-agent. A chemist of his caliber would never play martyr unless it suited his plan. He's been ahead of us since the start. Before we could respond, a faint creak echoed from the stair above. Holmes motioned for silence. He drew his revolver, the familiar glint of resolve returning to his features. Step by step, we climbed toward the hall. The air was colder there, the house utterly still. At the top of the landing, near the portrait of the old Bellwater ancestor, stood a figure cloaked in grey. The light from the half-shuttered window cut across his face, and there, unmistakably, was the lined, scholarly visage of Sir Alister Quinton, alive, gaunt, and smiling faintly. "I had hoped you would not return so soon, Mr. Holmes," he said. His voice was weaker than before, but its tone carried the same dry precision. "I wish to complete my work quietly." Holmes levelled his revolver. "Your work seems to require a growing number of graves, Sir Alister. You failed to silence the lady, and now you seek to finish what the poison began. Why?" Quinton's smile did not falter. "Because she carries something far more dangerous than guilt, a name. Fairchild was a thief, yes, but not alone. He and his allies bled my patents and Bellwater's trust funds alike. The ledgers she holds expose them all. Bankers, politicians, men whose fortunes rest upon silence. Had she spoken publicly, she would have been destroyed within the week. So I offered her mercy, death instead of ruin. And now you, Holmes, would hand her back to the wolves." Holmes's gaze did not waver. "And you would play God to spare her the scandal you helped engineer. You are not her saviour, Quinton. You are merely tidying your own corruption." A flicker of genuine fury crossed the older man's features. "You understand nothing. I meant to build a world where intellect, not money, dictated power. Fairchild stole that dream, turned science into commerce. I built the whisper to make them fear knowledge again." He took a step forward, his frail hand clutching a small metallic device that glimmered faintly, a trigger of some sort, wired with a fine filament. "The furnace still breathes, Mr. Holmes. With one press, the house becomes their tomb, and perhaps mine with it." Holmes's voice softened, though the pistol never dipped. "You mistake fear for justice, Sir Alistair. No truth survives when spoken through poison. Let her live. Let the evidence speak instead." For a heartbeat, the old man's eyes faltered, torn between pride and exhaustion. Then his hand trembled. The device slipped, striking the banister with a sharp, metallic clatter. Holmes lunged, knocking it aside as it sparked harmlessly. Quinton staggered back, clutching his chest. The fire in his eyes dimmed at last. "Perhaps you're right," he murmured. "But knowledge will always whisper, Holmes. Always." He collapsed against the stair, his breath leaving him in a long, rattling sigh. Holmes straightened, holstering his revolver. "Watson, fetch the constables. He has earned a quieter judgment than the one he planned." Miss Vale, still trembling, stared at Quinton's lifeless form. "Will they believe me now?" she whispered. Holmes turned toward her with a rare gentleness. "They will believe the evidence, Miss Vale. Truth, like the whisper, may travel through strange channels, but it reaches its mark eventually." As we led her from the house, the afternoon light poured through the stained glass, washing the staircase in hues of crimson and gold. Holmes paused midway down, looking once more at the silent grille. "Strange," he said softly. "Even now I could swear it listens. The house remembers too much." Outside, the air was brisk, the last of the fog lifting into a clear, cold sky. The street was alive again with movement, omnibuses clattering, vendors calling, and the weight of Ravenscroft's horrors seemed to fall behind us like a closing curtain. Holmes drew his coat close, his voice thoughtful but steady. "We chase whispers, Watson, yet it is the echo of human folly we always find at the end. The machinery changes, but the motive never does. Vanity, greed, fear, they are the true engineers of every infernal device." He glanced once more toward the great house, fading behind the veil of smoke. "Still," he added with a faint smile, "I fancy the world will sleep more soundly tonight. The whispering is finished, for now." And though I followed him wordlessly back into the restless heart of London, I could not help but think, as the cab wheels turned and the city swallowed the last trace of Ravenscroft House, that somewhere within those old walls the air itself might yet remember the voices that once gave it life. The ride back to Baker Street passed in silence, save for the rattle of the cab wheels and the faint hum of the city beginning to stir from its morning lethargy. Miss Vale had been taken to Scotland Yard once more, her confession complete and her evidence safely in Lestrade's hands. Sir Alistair Quinton's death, though dramatic, had brought a strange calm to the proceedings, like the final note of a symphony that had played too long in the dark. I studied Holmes's face under the pale light seeping through the cab window. It bore that familiar stillness, the kind that follows not satisfaction, but thought that refuses to rest. He spoke only once during the journey. "There are cases, Watson, where the intellect is both villain and victim. Quinton's tragedy lies in the fact that he sought control over knowledge itself, and in doing so became enslaved by it. He mistook dominion for understanding. He did not elaborate, and I knew better than to intrude upon his reflections." Back at Baker Street, he went straight to the desk, spread the recovered ledgers across it, and began examining their contents with quiet absorption. The handwriting, cramped and meticulous, chronicled years of transactions, coded in a cipher that only Holmes's methodical patience could hope to untangle. I brewed tea, and after a long interval, he looked up. "Observe, Watson, this is the ghost behind our ghost." He pointed to an entry dated nearly 2 years earlier. The Bellwater Trust, supposedly managed by Fairchild, channeled its surplus funds into a consortium called the Paracelsus Group. On the surface, it appeared to finance mining experiments, but its true purpose was the acquisition of rare minerals, arsenical compounds to be exact. The same material used in Quinton's whispering mechanism. This ledger connects Fairchild, Quinton, and a man we have not yet seen. "Another conspirator?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "A financier. Note the recurring signature, RC. These initials appear on every significant withdrawal. Quinton supplied the science, Fairchild the access, Miss Vale the distraction, but RC bankrolled it all. Without him, none of this would have left the laboratory." Lestrade arrived later that afternoon, still flushed with the bustle of official triumph. "Holmes, you've done it again. The Yard will sing your praises. The girl's statement matches every piece of your reconstruction. We'll list Quinton as the chief culprit and close the file within the week." Holmes smiled faintly, but did not rise from his chair. "And what of RC?" he asked. Lestrade blinked. "Who's that, then?" Holmes turned one of the ledgers toward him. "The missing architect. The initials appear throughout the accounts. Find him, and you may yet learn who whispered the first word of this affair." Lestrade frowned. "You think there's more?" Holmes's voice grew sharper. "There is always more, Inspector. Ravenscroft was not an isolated act of madness. It was an experiment, a prototype. The mechanism's precision, its chemistry, its financing, all point to continuation. Men like Quinton do not die without leaving their work to others." Lestrade promised to follow up, though his tone carried the polite doubt of a man accustomed to simpler conclusions. When he left, Holmes returned to the ledgers, transcribing figures into his notebook with rapid strokes. "The Paracelsus Group was dissolved 6 months ago," he said absently, "yet its assets were transferred to a holding firm in Vienna under the name of Rudolf Crane, a banker with connections to industrial laboratories across Europe. The same man, Watson, who funded the German electrical experiments I mentioned in our case of the copper phantasm. He is clever and ruthless." He lit his pipe and leaned back. "I believe Quinton was merely a pawn in a larger enterprise. The whispering staircase was a field test, a demonstration of atmospheric sound transmission through chemical pressure. Imagine such a device applied to statecraft, to espionage. A whisper could cross a city without a wire, and if mixed with vapor, it could kill." The notion chilled me. "You think this Crane intends to weaponize it?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Not directly, perhaps, but knowledge, once freed, finds its own masters. Ravenscroft was no mere murder. It was an audition. Somewhere in Europe, a new whisper is already being built." Evening descended, thick with the winter fog that wrapped London like a shroud. Holmes rose, restless again. "Come, Watson, we must pay a visit to the docks. Vienna shipments leave weekly from the Thames warehouses, and if my deduction holds, one crate among them bears the mark PG Machinery. That will be our next clue." We arrived at the wharf as gas lamps flickered to life along the quay. The air reeked of tar and salt. The masts swayed like ghostly sentinels above the fog. Holmes moved swiftly among the stacks of cargo, scanning stenciled markings with the precision of a bloodhound. At last he stopped before a row of sealed crates marked "Scientific Instruments, Property of P.G. & Co." He touched the label lightly, then crouched to examine the fastenings. "Fresh nails," he murmured, This shipment was packed no more than 2 days ago. Listen, there is movement inside." He pressed his ear to the wood, and for an instant we both heard it. A faint hum, rhythmic, mechanical, the pulse of some hidden engine. Before I could speak, a shadow detached itself from the mist behind the crates. A man stepped forward, tall, foreign-featured, his coat collar raised. In his gloved hand glimmered the shape of a small revolver. "You should not have come, Mr. Holmes," he said quietly, his accent Austrian. "The experiment is not yet complete." Holmes did not flinch. "Then it is fortunate, sir, that I make a habit of interrupting experiments before they perfect themselves. You must be Mr. Crane." The man smiled faintly. "Not Crane, his messenger. The next whisper will not be bound to a staircase, Mr. Holmes. It will travel through the very air you breathe." He raised the revolver. I had just time to shout Holmes's name before the shot cracked through the fog. The echo rolled across the river, mingling with the creak of masts and the slow, unending murmur of the Thames, as if the city itself had begun to whisper back. The gunshot split the fog with brutal finality. Instinct drove me forward, but Holmes had already moved. He dropped low, the bullet singing past where his head had been a fraction of a second before. The shot ricocheted off the iron edge of a winch and hissed into the river. Holmes lunged at the shooter, his hand closing around the man's wrist before the weapon could be fired again. They struggled amid the crates, boots slipping on the slick boards, until Holmes's elbow struck home beneath the man's chin. The revolver clattered away and vanished into the Thames with a hollow splash. I joined him at once, helping to subdue the stranger, who fought like an animal cornered by light. When at last we forced him against a pile of tarred canvas, Holmes tore away his scarf and froze. The face revealed was not that of an Austrian courier, but of a man we both knew too well, Inspector Lestrade, or rather, someone wearing Lestrade's likeness. For an instant the resemblance was uncanny, same wiry frame, same narrow face, but as the light caught his features, I saw the deception. The skin bore the faint sheen of prosthetic gum, and when Holmes tore it free, the disguise fell away to reveal another countenance beneath, older, sharper, coldly deliberate. "Rudolph Crane, I presume," Holmes said quietly. The man smiled through split lips. "You were meant to die here, Mr. Holmes. The world grows tired of detectives who meddle in progress." Holmes's voice turned to ice. "Progress built upon fear and poison is no progress at all. You financed Quinton's work. You armed him with resources no honest scholar could acquire. You used him to perfect your machine." Crane's eyes gleamed even through the pain. "And what of it? The whisper is the future. Sound without distance, power without blood. Quinton lacked vision. I intend to make the world listen, whether it wills or not." He spat blood to the side and gave a soft, mirthless laugh. "Do you think you've stopped me? That shipment behind you holds 6 prototypes, already bound for Vienna, each tuned to carry command and obedience through the air itself. Empires will pay dearly for such silence." Holmes said nothing for a long moment. He glanced toward the crates, his mind racing. "Then you have just told me enough to undo you," he murmured. In one motion he seized a lantern, smashed its glass upon the nearest crate, and flung the oil-soaked wick across the wood. Fire caught instantly, hissing along the tar seams like lightning along a fuse. Crane shouted in fury and lunged again, but I intercepted him, striking his arm away. The flames rose higher, licking the rope bindings until sparks leapt skyward. The dock erupted into chaos, sailors yelling, bells clanging. Holmes dragged me toward the open gangplank. "Run, Watson! The vapours will ignite the arsenic mixture!" We fled down the narrow quay as the first crate exploded. a thunderous roar that sent splinters and embers whirling through the fog. The shock wave hurled us against the cobblestones. When the smoke cleared, half the dock was ablaze, the river reflecting a ghastly, trembling light. I turned to look for Crane, but Holmes caught my arm. "He's gone into the river," he said grimly. "Whether by choice or by force I cannot say, but the Thames has swallowed many secrets." By dawn the fire was out, though the air still reeked of salt, oil, and ruin. We stood on the embankment, our faces blackened with soot. Lestrade himself arrived an hour later, pale and dishevelled, having been found bound and gagged in a carriage on the road to Paddington. "He took my coat," he muttered, half in disbelief. "Said I'd be safer asleep. By heaven, Holmes, I'll never live this one down." Holmes managed a weary smile. "On the contrary, Inspector, you may have just saved London the trouble of a new ghost story. Let the Yard claim its victory. Tell them the fire destroyed the last of the devices. The truth would only breed imitation." Lestrade nodded, too stunned to argue, and departed to make his report. When he was gone, Holmes gazed over the river, where smoke drifted like mourning veils above the ruins. "He called it progress, Watson," he said softly. "Yet his invention was only the perfection of deceit, a whisper that could command, control, kill. Imagine such a power in the hands of kings." "Then it is best that the river keeps it?" I said. "Perhaps," Holmes replied. "But ideas are like echoes, they return, however faintly. Some other mind will hear the call again and build anew." He drew his coat close and turned toward the waking city. "Come, my friend, the whispering staircase has spoken its last, but the voice behind it will not rest so easily. There are always more listeners than speakers in this world." We walked together through the thinning fog toward Baker Street, the dawn paling behind the rooftops. The sound of distant bells mingled with the sighing of the river, and I found myself glancing once over my shoulder. The docks lay quiet, yet I could have sworn that somewhere in the charred wreckage, beneath the hiss of cooling embers, there came a single, faint note, a whisper without breath or origin, dying even as it formed. Whether it was memory, wind, or something far older than either, I could not tell. Holmes did not turn back. "The case is over, Watson," he said gently. "Let the dead keep their secrets. The living have enough of their own." And as we stepped into the light, I felt that even London itself, vast, veiled, unknowable, was holding its breath, listening, as though the city feared that one day, beneath the rumble of its carriages and the murmur of its streets, the whisper might begin again. The next morning found Baker Street wrapped once more in its familiar grey calm. The fire in the grate hissed softly, the breakfast things lay untouched, and Holmes sat by the window, his dressing gown drawn close around him, his violin idle across his knees. The events at the dock had left their mark upon him, not of fatigue, but of the peculiar melancholy that so often followed his greatest triumphs. I had just finished reading aloud the Yard's official report, neatly concluding the entire affair with the deaths of Quinton and Crane, the arrest of Miss Vale, and the fortunate destruction of the whispering devices, when Holmes spoke without turning his head. "Watson, have you ever considered how many ghosts we have helped to create?" I looked up, startled. "Ghosts, Holmes?" He smiled faintly. "Not of flesh and bone, but of the mind. Every crime we uncover leaves behind its echo a residue of fear, secrecy, and fascination. The world feeds on such echoes. Sooner or later, someone always listens." Before I could answer, there came a brisk knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing an envelope sealed in red wax. "For you, Mr. Holmes, delivered by hand." He took it, broke the seal, and unfolded a single sheet of heavy cream paper. His expression sharpened as he read. "Interesting," he murmured. "Very interesting indeed." He passed the letter to me. The handwriting was elegant, continental, and unsigned. To the ever-curious Mr. Sherlock Holmes, your interference at the Thames was most inconvenient. You destroyed what you believed to be the last whisper, yet sound cannot die, only travel. The experiment continues far from your fog and morality. Should you wish to silence it again, follow the echo east. Vienna remembers. I set the letter down slowly. Then Crane survived. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Whether he lives or another carries his cause, the result is the same. The fire at the docks was meant to erase traces, not end the design. The phrase, "follow the echo east," is no mere taunt. It points toward the next phase, Vienna, as I suspected. The Paracelsus Group was only the British branch of a larger operation. But surely, Holmes, I protested, this is beyond the realm of murder. It borders on conspiracy, even warfare. Exactly so, he replied. You begin to grasp the scale of what we have touched. This whisper was never about one death or one device. It is a network of minds experimenting with fear itself, sound as weapon, influence, persuasion. Crane's ambition was only the first articulation of a darker motive. Somewhere in Europe, a cabal of financiers and scientists is refining it still. He stood abruptly and began pacing, the energy returning to his long frame. Do you recall the crate markings at the dock, PG and Coincidental? I've traced the manufacturer. Paracelsus Gewerkschaft, registered in Austria under the name of a Baron von Eltz, reputed to be both chemist and patron of experimental acoustics. Quinton may have learned his trade from him. I watched in silence as he retrieved a map from the shelf and pinned it to the wall. His finger tapped the city of Vienna, then followed a line northward to Prague. This route is no accident. Both cities possess underground laboratories, relics of old universities and alchemists' guilds. If the next whisper is being prepared, it will be there. I hesitated. You mean to pursue it? He looked at me sharply. Would you have me do otherwise? Every hour that passes may give them time to refine their invention, to spread their influence. Fear, Watson, is a contagion. If it can be transmitted through sound, it will not stop at one nation's border. Before I could answer, the door burst open again and Lestrade entered, dishevelled and flushed. Holmes! You're not going to believe this. They've found a body at Blackfriars Pier, washed up at dawn, male, middle-aged, coat torn by shot. The face burned beyond recognition, but in the pocket, a medallion bearing the initials R.C., the Yard swears it's Crane. Holmes's expression did not change. Too neat, he said softly. A corpse without a face is an invitation, not an ending. If he wished us to believe he was dead, that would be the surest way. No, Lestrade, the river has not given us his remains. It has given us his decoy. Lestrade exhaled. Blast it, Holmes, you'll have me doubting the dead now. You would be wise to do so, Holmes replied. Crane's mind was one step ahead. Even as his schemes collapsed, he knew the Yard would search the river. A substitute body, weighted with his coat and trinkets, would close the file for good. When Lestrade had gone, Holmes turned to me with that glint I knew too well, the light of impending pursuit. Pack your revolver, Watson. There will be no rest in London tonight. We take the first train to the continent. The afternoon passed in swift preparation. By dusk, we were aboard the Calais Express, the wind sharp through the open corridor windows. Holmes sat opposite me in the compartment, his eyes half closed, but his mind evidently racing. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels filled the silence until he said, almost to himself, "Sound moves in waves, and so does human ambition. We may drown one tide, but another will always rise behind it." As night deepened, I could not shake the image of the whispering staircase, mute now, yet somehow alive in memory, as if the house itself had exhaled one last secret into the world. Somewhere ahead, across the black waters and distant rails, that secret was gathering strength again. Holmes's voice cut through my thoughts. "Watson," he said quietly, "when we reach Vienna, we tread not upon crime, but upon the edge of invention and madness. Keep your pistol ready, but keep your reason sharper. This is no longer a case of murder, it is a contest of minds." He closed his eyes then, as though listening to something beyond the hum of the train. For a long while, neither of us spoke. Outside, the wind howled along the carriage roof, and beneath it, just for an instant, perhaps born of fatigue or fancy, I thought I heard it again, a faint whisper threading through the sound of the wheels, distant yet deliberate, carrying a single word that made my blood run cold. Vienna. Holmes opened his eyes, and I saw in them both triumph and foreboding. "You hear it too, then," he murmured. "Good. It means we are already expected." The journey to Vienna was marked by long silences and the steady rhythm of anticipation. Holmes, seated across from me, stared through the frost-misted glass as the landscape shifted from the soot-stained plains of France to the dark, snow-capped spires of the Alps. His eyes held that rare light I had come to recognize only when he sensed a design nearing completion, a pattern whose outline only he could perceive. By the time we arrived at the Westbahnhof, the city lay under a heavy pall of winter fog, its streets glistening with sleet, its people moving briskly through the mist like phantoms. Holmes wasted no time. "We begin," he said, "not with the living, but with the records. The dead always keep better accounts." Within hours, he had secured access to the registry of the Paracelsus Gewerkschaft, aided by an obliging attaché at the British Embassy. There, amid the yellowed files and ledgers, we found what we sought. Entries, dated weeks after the supposed deaths of both Sir Alistair Quinton and Rudolph Crane. The signature matched Crane's hand exactly, but beneath it was a new name, Dr. R. Conrad. The location, Institute for Psychoacoustic, Vienna. That night, as snow fell softly against the lamplight, Holmes led me through the narrow streets to a derelict quarter on the edge of the Danube Canal. The building we sought stood half in ruin, its upper windows blackened by soot. From within came a faint vibration, low, rhythmic, like the hum of a distant machine. Holmes's face hardened. "He's rebuilt it, Watson. Not a whisper this time, but a chorus." We entered by a side door. The interior was a labyrinth of stone corridors leading to a large, vaulted chamber where a strange apparatus dominated the floor. A circular array of metal tubes and polished mirrors surrounding a single brass chair. At the center, adjusting the levers with calm precision, stood Rudolph Crane. His face was pale, spectral under the lamps, but his eyes burned with undiminished fervor. "So," he said softly, as though greeting an expected guest, "London's hound has followed the echo at last." Holmes's revolver glinted. "You've gone too far, Crane. Quinton's machine was a folly. This is madness." "Madness?" Crane smiled thinly. "You call it madness to perfect the means by which thought may travel without sound, to strip language down to pure intent? The whisper was only the beginning. Now I can shape suggestion itself, fear, obedience, memory. A single note, Mr. Holmes, can command an army or quiet a nation." Holmes's voice was steady, though I saw his eyes dart across the mechanism, tracing its every joint. "And yet, for all your mastery of sound, you fail to hear the simplest truth, that no man can conduct humanity as if it were a symphony. You seek control, not understanding." Crane's gaze darkened. "Understanding is irrelevant when one possesses power." With that, he threw a switch. The machine shuddered to life, its mirrors vibrating in unison until the very air trembled. A deep, pulsing hum filled the chamber, a resonance that seemed to reach inside the skull. My thoughts blurred, a cold dread blooming at the edge of consciousness. Holmes staggered, one hand pressed to his temple. Crane laughed. "You feel it, don't you? The frequency of submission." Holmes dropped to one knee, but instead of firing, his hand darted to the base of the nearest tube. "Indeed," he gasped, "and like all music, it depends on its pitch." With one swift motion, he wrenched the tuning lever to its limit. The resulting vibration turned shrill, unbearable. The mirrors fractured, bursting outward in a storm of glass and smoke. The wave collapsed with a deafening roar. When the haze cleared, Crane lay sprawled beside the ruined chair, the machinery silent around him. Holmes rose slowly, the pistol still in his grasp, though he had not fired a single shot. I hurried to Crane's side, but one look told me he was beyond help. His pulse was still, his eyes fixed upon the ceiling, as though listening to echoes only he could hear. Holmes stood over him. "He died by his own frequency," he said quietly. "A mind consumed by the vibration it created." He turned to me with weary eyes. "The world is safer, Watson, but not wiser. It never is." We left before dawn, the Institute already stirring with police and diplomats. By noon, we were aboard the return train, London-bound through the whitening fields. Holmes spoke little. When he did, it was almost to himself. Every invention begins with the desire to conquer nature and ends with nature conquering man. The whisper was no different. "What began as curiosity became contagion," I said gently. "And yet it was you who silenced it, Holmes." He smiled faintly. "No, my friend. I merely tuned it to its end." When we reached Baker Street days later, the city was blanketed in fog once more, as if it had never stirred. Holmes sank into his armchair, drew the violin to his chin, and let a low note fill the room, steady, pure, without menace. "Do you hear it, Watson?" he said after a moment. "Sound without fear, the most fragile thing in the world." I wrote the last lines of my account that night, while the fire burned low and the street lamps glowed faintly beyond the window. The whispering staircase, Ravenscroft House, Quinton Crane, all were dust now. Yet even as I set down my pen, I thought I heard something, a faint vibration, no louder than breath, rising from the floorboards below. I smiled at my own imagination, closed the journal, and turned toward the quiet figure by the fire. Holmes' eyes half closed, still played that single unbroken note, soft, deliberate, and endlessly human, until at last the whisper itself seemed to dissolve into peace,